You want him to live or die? Dr. Paige Mitchell's voice slices through the chaos of Atlanta General's ER, her eyes blazing as she faces down a gang of outlaws. A thug lunges, but Paige's high kick cracks his face, dropping him like a stone. The room gasps. Will she save their dying boss or let him bleed out? This is where courage meets fury, and one woman rewrites the rules. Where are you tuning in from? Drop your city in the comments and tell us, will Paige triumph or will the Iron Reapers crush her? Hit that subscribe button to catch our latest stories of defiance and heart. Don't miss what's coming. Why does a feared kingpin call her sis? Can a doctor's oath spark an impossible love? Stick around to unravel the truth, share your thoughts, and join our bold community. The emergency room of Atlanta General Hospital pulsed with a frenetic rhythm, a cacophony of beeping monitors, hurried footsteps, and the sharp tang of antiseptic hanging in the air. It was a battlefield where life and death waged their silent war, and Dr. Paige Mitchell was its unflinching general. At 34, Paige was a trauma surgeon of rare brilliance, her dark skin glistening under the fluorescent glare, her white coat a symbol of authority earned through years of defying odds. Her hands, steady as steel, had stitched together shattered lives, and her mind, sharp as a scalpel, navigated the chaos with grace. Tonight, the ER was a maelstrom. Car accident victims groaned on stretchers, a heart attack patient wheezed under an oxygen mask, and a small boy clutched his broken arm, tears streaking his face. Paige moved between them, her voice a calm anchor, directing nurses with clip precision. Push epinephrine for bed 3. X-ray for the kid in 5. Move! The clock above the triage desk ticked past 9, its hands indifferent to the lives hanging in the balance. Paige was reviewing a chart, her brow furrowed over a patient's dropping vitals, when the double doors at the ER's entrance exploded inward with a force that silenced the room. 5 men stormed in, their heavy boots thudding against the linoleum, leather jackets creaking with menace. The air shifted, thickened with the weight of danger. Patients froze, their eyes wide. A mother pulled her child closer, and the security guard, a portly man named Carl, fumbled for his radio, his fingers trembling. The men's presence was a violation, a dark tide crashing into the hospital's fragile order. At the center of the group, 2 men half carried a 6th, his body sagging, blood soaking his black shirt and dripping onto the floor in a grim trail. This was Felix Fury Donovan, leader of the Iron Reapers, Atlanta's most feared gang. His face was ashen, his breaths shallow, each one a labored rasp. A bullet had torn through his abdomen, and his piercing blue eyes, half lidded with pain, flickered with a fading fire. The tallest of his crew, a wiry man with a jagged scar slicing his cheek, shoved past a nurse, sending a tray of instruments clattering to the ground. "Where's the damn doctor?" he barked, his voice a snarl that echoed off the walls. "Now!" The room stilled, the only sound the faint beep of a heart monitor. Dr. Ellis, a nervous resident with sweat beading on his forehead, shrank back, his clipboard clutched like a shield. Dr. Nguyen, usually composed, exchanged a panicked glance with a nurse, her hands frozen mid-task. The waiting room's occupants, patients, families, staff, seemed to hold their breath, as if the slightest movement might ignite the powder keg before them. But Paige Mitchell didn't flinch. She set down her chart with deliberate calm, her dark eyes locking onto the scarred man. She stepped forward, her sneakers silent on the blood-streaked floor, her posture unyielding. "I'm the doctor," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "What's the injury?" The scarred man, Tommy, sneered, his lips curling to reveal a gold-capped tooth. "Our boss took a bullet. You fix him first, or this place burns." His words were a gauntlet thrown down with the confidence of a man used to getting his way. He gestured to Felix, whose head lolled against the shoulder of the man supporting him, blood pooling beneath his boots. The threat hung heavy, a dark promise that sent a shiver down the room. Carl, the security guard, stammered into his radio, but his voice was drowned by Tommy's next words. "You deaf lady! Move!" Paige's pulse quickened, but her face remained a mask of composure. She'd faced down chaos before. Gunshot wounds, car wrecks, hearts that stopped mid-beat. But this was different. This was a storm of human making, a clash of wills in a room full of lives she'd sworn to protect. Her gaze flicked to Felix, assessing him in an instant. Pale, clammy, his breathing erratic. He was minutes from bleeding out, and she knew it. But she also knew that cowering to threats would unravel the fragile order of her ER. She straightened, her voice steady, resonant. "No one gets priority by threatening my staff. Step back, or he's dead before I touch him." A murmur rippled through the gang, a mix of disbelief and anger. Tommy's sneer faltered, replaced by a flash of fury. He took a step closer, towering over Paige, his breath hot with menace. "You don't call the shots here," he growled, cracking his knuckles. Behind him, Felix stirred, his voice a weak rasp, barely audible but laced with authority. "Tommy, show her who's in charge." The words were a spark, igniting Tommy's bravado. He grinned, his hand darting out to grab Paige's arm, his grip a prelude to violence. The waiting room braced for impact, expecting Paige to crumble under the weight of the Reaper's reputation. But Paige Mitchell was no stranger to fights. Raised in a neighborhood where survival meant standing tall, she'd honed her body and mind in karate dojos, her discipline as fierce as her intellect. As Tommy's hand closed around her wrist, she moved, swift, precise, a blur of controlled power. She twisted free, her elbow arcing upward to slam into Tommy's jaw with a sickening crack. He staggered back, clutching his face, shock replacing his sneer. Another Reaper, a burly man with a shaved head, lunged at her, his fist aimed at her shoulder. Paige sidestepped, her high kick snapping out to catch him square in the chest. He hit the floor with a thud, gasping for air. The third man hesitated, his hand hovering over a concealed weapon. But Paige's glare pinned him in place, her eyes blazing with a fire that dared him to move. She spun to face the group, her voice a whip that cracked through the stunned silence. "You want him to live or die? Keep this up, and he's dead in 10 minutes. The gang froze, their bravado shattered. Tommy, still clutching his jaw, looked to Felix, who managed a weak nod, pain etching lines into his rugged face. Paige didn't wait for permission. "Get him to Trauma Bay 1, she ordered, her tone leaving no room for defiance. The Reapers complied, hauling Felix onto a gurney, their movements hurried, almost reverent. Paige turned to the nurses, her voice snapping them out of their daze. "Prep for surgery. Type and cross his blood. Move!" As the gurney rolled toward the trauma bay, the ER exhaled, the tension easing but not breaking. Patients whispered, their fear now laced with awe. Carl's radio crackled, security finally responding. But Paige was already gone, her focus locked on the man bleeding out under her care. The Iron Reapers had stormed in expecting to bend the hospital to their will, but they'd met Paige Mitchell, a woman who bowed to no one, not even the shadow of Atlanta's most feared kingpin. The storm had come, and she was its eye, calm and unyielding. The trauma bay of Atlanta General Hospital was a crucible, a stark white chamber where life clung to the edge of a knife. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp bite of antiseptic, undercut by the relentless beep of monitors charting a fading heartbeat. Dr. Paige Mitchell stood at the center of this storm, her dark eyes locked on the gurney where Felix Fury Donovan lay, his life seeping away in crimson rivulets. The Iron Reaper's leader was a shadow of the myth that preceded him, pale, his rugged features slack, his breaths shallow gasps. A 9mm bullet had carved a brutal path through his abdomen, and time was a luxury Paige didn't have. The bay's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, but Paige's focus was a beacon, unyielding amidst the chaos. The Reapers crowded the doorway, their leather jackets and grim faces a stark contrast to the sterile room. Tommy, the scarred enforcer, clutched his bruised jaw, his earlier bravado replaced by a simmering unease. The others, men with hard eyes and clenched fists, watched Paige with a mix of resentment and desperation, their boss's fate now in the hands of the woman they'd tried to intimidate. The hospital staff, though rattled, moved with practiced efficiency at Paige's command. Nurse Carla, a seasoned veteran with graying hair, hooked Felix to an IV, her hands steady despite the gang's looming presence. A younger nurse, Jamal, hesitated, his eyes darting to the Reapers, but Paige's voice snapped him into action. "Get me a trauma panel stat," she ordered, her tone a whip that cut through the tension. Felix's vitals were dire. Blood pressure plummeting, pulse thready, oxygen saturation barely holding. Page's mind raced, cataloging the damage. Internal bleeding, likely a lacerated spleen. The bullet's path, a wild card that could have shredded arteries or organs. She leaned over Felix, her gloved hands probing the wound, ignoring the sticky warmth soaking through her sleeves. "He's crashing," Carla warned, her voice tight as the monitor screamed a flatline. The Reapers stirred, a low growl of panic rising, but Paige didn't flinch. "Defibrillator now!" she barked, her hands already ripping open Felix's shirt to expose his chest, slick with blood and sweat. Jamal wheeled the crash cart forward, and Paige grabbed the paddles, her movements fluid, honed by years of wrestling death into submission. "Clear," she shouted, and the room held its breath as she delivered a jolt. Felix's body arched, then fell still, the monitor silent. Tommy stepped forward, his voice a snarl. "You better not let him die, lady." Paige's eyes flicked to him, a flash of steel in her gaze that silenced him. "Back off," she said, low and lethal, before turning back to the paddles. "Charge again. Clear." Another shock, and the monitor flickered, a weak blip signaling a heartbeat. "Got him," Carla whispered, relief threading her voice. But the fight was far from over. Felix's pulse was fragile, a thread Paige had to anchor. She turned to the surgical tray, her hands a blur as she prepped for an emergency laparotomy. "Scrub in," she told Carla, who nodded, already moving to the sink. The Reapers watched, their aggression dulled by the raw stakes unfolding before them. Paige's scalpel gleamed under the lights, her incision precise, parting skin and muscle to reveal the carnage within. Blood pooled, obscuring her view, but her fingers, guided by instinct and training, navigated the chaos. "Suction," she said, and Jamal complied, his earlier fear replaced by focus under her command. The bullet had torn through Felix's spleen, leaving a jagged wound that bled with every heartbeat. Paige's hands moved with the grace of a maestro, clamping vessels, suturing with needle and thread as fine as spider silk. Each stitch was a defiance, a refusal to let death claim this man, not because of who he was, but because she'd taken an oath to save. Sweat beaded on her brow, but her focus never wavered, even as the monitors wailed warnings. "Pressure's dropping again," Carla said, her voice steady but urgent. Paige nodded, her mind racing through options. "Push 2 units of Oneg. Hang a dopamine drip." Outside the bay, the ER buzzed with its battles, but here time seemed to compress, each second a pulse in the fight for Felix's life. The Reapers, for all their menace, were reduced to spectators, their power meaningless against the reality of mortality. Tommy's scarred face twitched, his eyes locked on Felix's still form, while another Reaper, a wiry man with a shaved head, muttered a prayer under his breath. Paige caught the sound, a faint reminder that even outlaws bled and feared like anyone else. But she had no time for their humanity. Her world was the open wound, the faltering heart, the clock ticking down. After nearly an hour, Paige found the bullet, lodged against a vertebra, its jagged edges a silent killer. She extracted it with forceps, the soft clink as it hit the tray, a victory no one celebrated. The spleen was unsalvageable. She removed it with swift cuts, her hands steady despite the strain. "Closing now," she said, her voice calm, though her muscles ached from the tension. Layer by layer she sutured, sealing Felix's fate with each precise stitch. The monitors stabilized, the beep steadying into a rhythm that promised life, at least for now. Paige stepped back, her gloves slick with blood, her white coat stained crimson. She stripped off the gloves, tossing them into a biohazard bin, and turned to Carla. "Get him to the ICU. Monitor for sepsis." Carla nodded, her eyes reflecting a quiet awe. The Reapers parted as the gurney was wheeled out, their silence a concession to the woman who'd just pulled their boss from the brink. Tommy met Paige's gaze, his jaw still swollen from her earlier strike, but he said nothing, his defiance tempered by respect. Paige exhaled, the weight of the moment settling into her bones. The trauma bay, now quiet, felt like a battlefield after the smoke cleared. Scarred but standing. She glanced at the clock, just past midnight. The fight had lasted hours, but it felt like a lifetime. Felix Donovan was alive, and though she didn't know it yet, the man she'd saved would change her world. For now she was Paige Mitchell, the surgeon who'd faced down a gang and won, her defiance a spark that still burned bright in the sterile light. The ICU at Atlanta General Hospital was a realm of hushed intensity, where the line between life and death was as thin as the sterile curtain separating each bed. The air hummed with the soft whir of ventilators and the rhythmic beep of monitors, a mechanical lullaby for those clinging to existence. Felix Fury Donovan, leader of the Iron Reapers, lay in bed 7, his once imposing frame diminished by bandages and IV lines. His skin, pale from blood loss, contrasted sharply with the dark ink of tattoos snaking across his arms. A skull wreathed in flames, a coiled viper, symbols of a life forged in defiance. Yet his piercing blue eyes, now alert, burned with a restless energy, tracking every movement in the room. Felix was alive, a fact that still seemed to surprise him, and his gaze kept returning to the woman who'd made it possible, Dr. Paige Mitchell. Paige moved through her rounds with the precision of a conductor, her white coat crisp despite the long shift, her dark skin glowing under the muted lights. At 34, she was a force in the hospital, her reputation as a trauma surgeon matched only by her unyielding resolve. The events in the ER, her takedown of Felix's men, her race to save his life, had cemented her as a legend among the staff, though she brushed off the whispers with a quiet focus. Today she approached Felix's bed, her chart in hand, her expression professional but guarded. The Reapers, ever present, loitered near the ICU's entrance, their leather jackets swapped for hoodies in a half-hearted nod to hospital rules. Tommy, his jaw still bruised from Paige's elbow, leaned against the wall, his eyes narrowing as she passed. But he kept his distance, a silent acknowledgement of her authority. Paige checked Felix's vitals, her fingers deft as she adjusted the IV drip. His chart showed progress. Stable blood pressure, no signs of infection. But the man himself was a wild card. She met his gaze unflinching and found a flicker of amusement in his eyes, a spark that belied his weakened state. "You didn't flinch," Felix said, his voice rough like gravel under boots, but softer than she'd expected. "Most people would have run from my crew." His words carried a weight, not just gratitude but curiosity, as if he were sizing her up, searching for the source of her steel. Paige arched a brow, her tone dry. "I don't run, and you were a mess, hardly worth running from." A faint smirk tugged at Felix's lips, the first crack in the myth of Fury Donovan, Atlanta's feared kingpin. She'd heard the stories, whispers of bar fights, backroom deals, a man who ruled the city's underworld with an iron fist. Yet here he was, grounded by her sutures, his bravado tempered by the reality of his brush with death. Paige jotted a note on his chart, aware of his eyes following her, not with menace but with something else, interest perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit who thrived under pressure. The ICU was no place for idle talk, but Felix seemed determined to pierce the silence. "You got a black belt in badass, Doc?" he asked, his smirk widening as he gestured weakly to his bandaged abdomen. "Or just lucky with that elbow?" Paige paused, her pen hovering over the chart. She could have shut him down, kept the line between doctor and patient firm, but something in his tone, playful, almost respectful, drew her in. "No luck," she said, her voice cool but laced with a hint of humor. "Years of karate. You should try it. Might keep you out of my OR." A low chuckle escaped Felix, cut short by a wince as he shifted. The sound surprised her, humanizing the man she'd only known as a bleeding body on her table. She glanced at the Reapers, catching Tommy's scowl. But another member, a wiry man named Rico with a shaved head, grinned, nudging his friend. "She's got your number, boss," Rico muttered, loud enough for Paige to hear. The nickname Sis slipped out as he addressed her. "Sis, you keep him in line, yeah?" And Paige rolled her eyes, though a faint smile betrayed her amusement. The Reaper's deference, however grudging, was a shift, a ripple from the night she'd faced them down. As Paige adjusted Felix's monitor, she noticed small details that clashed with his outlaw image. A candy bar, half-eaten, sat on his bedside table. A gift he'd slipped to a kid in the waiting room earlier, according to a nurse's gossip. His voice, though rough, softened when he thanked Carla, the nurse who'd changed his bandages, for her care with an elderly patient down the hall. These glimpses were at odds with the myth of Fury Donovan, painting a man who wasn't just a storm, but a shelter for those he claimed as his own. Paige filed the observation away. Her curiosity piqued despite herself. The hospital's rhythm pressed on, but Felix's presence was a low hum of disruption. Nurses whispered about the Reaper's constant vigil, their loyalty to their boss palpable even in the sterile confines of the ICU. Paige caught fragments of their world, muttered talk of deals and turf, but her focus remained on her patient. She checked his incision, her fingers gentle but clinical, and noted the healing tissue with a nod. "You're not out of the woods, chum," she told him, her voice firm. "Push too hard and you'll be back under my knife." Felix's eyes held hers, a challenge lurking beneath his fatigue. "Noted, Doc, but I'm tougher than I look." His tone was light, but there was steel in it, a reminder of the man who commanded Atlanta's shadows. Paige didn't back down, her gaze steady. "You'd better be. I don't save people twice." The words were a gauntlet, tossed with the same fire she'd shown in the ER, and Felix's smirk returned, a silent acknowledgement of the game they'd begun. As Paige turned to leave, Rico called after her, "Sis, you're all right." The nickname, absurdly familiar, hung in the air, and she shook her head, hiding a smile. The ICU's curtain swayed as she moved to her next patient, but Felix's presence lingered, a puzzle she hadn't meant to solve. He was no longer just a name or a wound. He was a man, complex and contradictory, whose life she'd tethered to her own with every stitch. The myth of Fury Donovan was unraveling, and Paige, though she didn't know it yet, was already caught in its threads, her world tilting toward a collision she couldn't foresee. The Atlanta night was a velvet curtain, pierced by the distant hum of traffic and the soft glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the hospital's parking lot. Dr. Paige Mitchell stepped out of Atlanta General's sliding doors, her scrubs clinging to her skin after a grueling 12-hour shift. At 34, she was a pillar in the chaos of the ER, her dark eyes sharp with the focus that had saved countless lives, her presence a quiet command. But tonight, as she tugged her jacket tighter against the cool air, her thoughts drifted to a man who'd become an unexpected fixture in her world. Felix Fury Donovan, the Iron Reaper's leader she'd pulled back from death's edge a week ago. He'd been discharged days earlier, yet his shadow lingered, not in menace but in a strange, persistent pull she couldn't quite name. Felix had become a regular at the hospital, showing up with flimsy excuses, a box of coffee for the staff, a vague claim of checking on a friend in the ER. Each visit was a chance to cross paths with Paige, their encounters brief but charged like flint striking steel. She'd catch him in the break room, his leather jacket slung over a chair, his rugged features softened by a grin as he teased her about her coffee order. "Black, no sugar." "You're tougher than me, Doc," he'd said once, his blue eyes glinting with mischief. Paige had shot back, "Tough enough to keep you alive, so don't test me." Their banter was a dance, sharp and playful, each exchange peeling back the layers of the man she'd once known only as a bleeding outlaw. Tonight, as Paige headed toward her car, she spotted him leaning against a lamppost near the staff lot, his silhouette unmistakable. Broad shoulders, dark jeans, a faint scar above his brow catching the light. He straightened as she approached, his hands tucked into his pockets, his usual bravado tempered by something quieter, almost tentative. "Late shift, Doc?" he called, his voice rough but warm, cutting through the night's stillness. Paige slowed, her heart giving an uncharacteristic lurch. "You stalking me now, Donovan?" she asked, her tone dry but laced with a smile she couldn't suppress. Felix chuckled, the sound low and genuine, a contrast to the fierce reputation that preceded him. "Nah, just in the neighborhood." His excuse was flimsy, and they both knew it. He stepped closer, the gravel crunching under his boots, and Paige noticed the faint tension in his posture, as if he were weighing his words. "Got you something," he said, pulling a small paper bag from his jacket. Inside was a blueberry muffin, still warm, from the diner across the street. "Figured you skip dinner on nights like this." The gesture was simple, but it caught her off guard, a crack in the armor of the man called Fury. Paige took the bag, her fingers brushing his, the contact sending a spark through her veins. "You're gonna ruin your tough guy rep with this," she said, arching a brow, but her voice was softer, betraying the warmth spreading in her chest. Felix's grin widened, boyish yet fierce. "Worth it if it gets me a smile, Doc." For a moment they stood there, the hospital's hum fading into the background, the world narrowing to the space between them. Paige's pulse quickened, not from fear but from the realization that Felix was no longer just a patient or a problem. He was a man, flawed and fascinating, who saw her in a way few others did. They walked toward her car, the conversation shifting to deeper waters. Felix spoke of his past, his words halting at first as if unaccustomed to vulnerability. He'd grown up in a fractured home, he said, where love was scarce and survival meant fighting. The Reapers, for all their flaws, were his family, a bond forged in loyalty rather than blood. "I yell loud to keep 'em in line," he admitted, his voice low. "But it's a shield. Keeps the world at arm's length." Paige listened, her guard softening as she recognized a kindred spirit. Someone who, like her, had built walls to thrive in a world that often pushed back. In turn, she shared a piece of herself, her voice steady but raw. "Med school wasn't just exam," she said, leaning against her car, the muffin bag still in hand. "It was proving I belonged, black, female, from a neighborhood like yours. Every room I walked into, I had to fight to be seen." Felix's eyes held hers, not with pity but with respect, a silent acknowledgement of their shared defiance. "You don't just walk in, Doc," he said. "You own the room." The words, simple but fierce, landed like a spark, igniting something unspoken between them. The night deepened, stars piercing the Georgia sky. They stood by her car, the air charged with a current neither could ignore. Felix stepped closer, his hand reaching out, hesitant, to tuck a stray braid behind her ear. "Why'd you fight for me?" he asked, his voice a rough whisper, vulnerability stripping away the outlaw's mask. "You could have let me bleed out. No one would have blamed you." Paige's breath caught, her eyes searching his, rugged, handsome, scarred in ways that went beyond skin. "I took an oath," she said, her voice steady but soft. "And I saw something worth saving." The words hung between them, a bridge across their worlds. Felix's hand lingered near her cheek, his touch a question she answered by closing the distance. "You're trouble, Doc," he murmured, his lips inches from hers. "The kind I don't want to walk away from." Paige's heart raced, her smile a quiet dare. "Good. I don't save just anyone." Their kiss was electric, a collision of fire and resolve under the starlit sky, sealing a bond that defied the odds. As they pulled apart, breathless, Paige knew this was no fleeting spark. It was a flame, and it was only beginning to burn. The Atlanta dusk painted the city in hues of amber and indigo, its skyline a jagged silhouette against the fading light. In Paige Mitchell's modest apartment, the air was warm with the scent of garlic and thyme, the sizzle of a skillet punctuating the quiet. Dr. Paige Mitchell at 34A, Titan in Atlanta General's ER, stood at the stove, her dark skin catching the glow of a single lamp. Her hands, so steady in surgery, stirred a pan of shrimp and grits with a rare ease. Her focus softened by the presence of Felix "Fury" Donovan. The Iron Reaper's leader sat at her small kitchen table, his broad frame dwarfing the chair, a glass of cheap red wine in his hand. His leather jacket hung on the door, a silent nod to the life he was trying to temper for her, though its shadow lingered in his scarred knuckles and the wary glint in his blue eyes. Weeks had passed since their kiss under the stars, a moment that had ignited a love as fierce as it was improbable. Felix was changing, his rough edges smoothed by Paige's influence, but the path was fraught with friction. He'd scaled back the Reaper's darker dealings, swapping extortion for protection rackets that shielded local businesses, a shift that earned grumbles from his crew, but kept the peace in Atlanta's underbelly. His nights, once spent in smoky backrooms, now belonged to Paige, filled with quiet dinners, old jazz records, and debates over her favorite films. Yet the weight of his world pressed against their fragile harmony, a fault line waiting to crack. Tonight, tension simmered beneath their ease. Felix watched Paige, his gaze tracing the curve of her braid, the way her laughter lit the room when he teased her about her cooking. "You sure you're a surgeon, Doc? This ain't half bad," he said, his grin boyish but strained. Paige shot him a mock glare, tossing a dish towel at him. "Keep talking, Donovan, and you'll be eating takeout." But her smile faded as she caught the flicker of unease in his eyes, a tell she'd learned to read. "What's on your mind?" she asked, setting the pan aside, her voice gentle but probing. Felix leaned back, his fingers tightening around the glass. "Got a call today. Some new crews moving in on our turf. Reapers want me to handle it the old way. Fists, maybe worse." His words were heavy, a confession of the life he couldn't fully escape. Paige's chest tightened, her mind flashing to the blood-soaked night she'd saved him, the chaos of his world spilling into hers. She crossed her arms, her surgeon's calm masking the storm within. "And what's your way now?" she asked, her tone a challenge, though her eyes held a quiet plea. He met her gaze, his jaw set. "I told him to stand down, set up a meet instead. No blood." His voice was firm, but the effort it took was clear, a kingpin reining in his instincts for a woman who'd become his compass. Paige exhaled, relief warring with doubt. She knew what he was risking, his crew's loyalty, his reputation, the fragile empire he'd built. But she also knew what she'd staked, her heart, her principles, a life built on saving, not destroying. "You're trying," she said, stepping closer, her hand resting on his. "That's enough for now." Their moment was shattered by a sharp knock at the door. Felix tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he no longer carried. Paige frowned, checking the peephole to find Rico, one of Felix's reapers, his face taut with urgency. She opened the door, and Rico's eyes flicked between them, his voice low. "Boss, trouble at the warehouse. That new crew, they hit one of our guys." Felix's expression darkened, the old fury rising like a specter. He stood, but Paige grabbed his arm, her grip firm. "You said no blood," she reminded him, her voice steel. Felix hesitated, torn between his past and the man he wanted to be. "I'll talk him down," he said finally, his eyes promising her more than words could. The night erupted into a test of his resolve. Felix left with Rico, and Paige paced her apartment, her mind racing. She trusted him, but his world was a wildfire, and she feared it could consume them both. Hours later, he returned, his knuckles unbloodied, but his face etched with exhaustion. "Settled it," he said, collapsing onto her couch. "No fight, just words." Paige sat beside him, her relief palpable, but she saw the cost in his eyes, the strain of defying his nature. "You did good," she whispered, her hand cupping his cheek, grounding him. Their love grew in these quiet victories, forged in the crucible of their differences. Felix's crew, sensing his shift, began to embrace Paige, their sis now a fixture at their gatherings. One evening, Felix surprised her with a stray puppy he'd rescued from an alley, its floppy ears a stark contrast to his tough exterior. "Thought you'd like a patient who doesn't carry a gun," he said, his grin disarming. Paige laughed, pulling him into a kiss, the puppy yipping between them. The Reapers noticed his softer side, joking he'd gone soft for the doc, but their loyalty held, bolstered by Paige's strength. Yet challenges lingered. Arguments flared when Felix's ties to the Reapers pulled him into late-night calls, his voice rising in ways that echoed his old life. Paige pushed back, her surgeon's precision cutting through his defenses. "I'm not here to fix you," she told him once, her eyes blazing. "But I won't love a man who breaks what I build." Her words were a line in the sand, and Felix, to his credit, listened, his apologies raw but real. They fought for each other, their love a bridge between her world of healing and his of shadows. In Paige's apartment, surrounded by the warmth of their shared life, Felix was no longer just fury. He was a man learning to love without control, to lead without fear. Paige, too, felt a shift. His honesty, his fierce loyalty, awakened a fire she'd buried under discipline. As they lay together, the city's pulse a distant hum, she traced the scars on his hand, each one a story he was rewriting with her. Their love was imperfect, a work in progress, But it was theirs, built on courage and the quiet moments that changed them both. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Regency Hotel shimmered under a cascade of crystal chandeliers, their golden light dancing across polished marble floors. The hospital's annual gala was a spectacle of elegance, a night where Atlanta's medical elite mingled with philanthropists, their laughter mingling with the clinking of champagne flutes. Dr. Paige Mitchell stood at the room's edge, a vision in a burgundy gown that hugged her frame, its deep hue a bold contrast to her dark skin. At 34, she was a cornerstone of Atlanta General's ER, her brilliance as a trauma surgeon matched only by her unyielding spirit. Tonight, though, her eyes weren't on the crowd, but on the man beside her, Felix Fury Donovan, the Iron Reaper's leader, whose presence turned heads and sparked whispers. His tailored black suit couldn't hide the outlaw in him, but his arm around Paige's waist was a quiet claim, a promise forged in fire. The gala was a milestone, a public testament to the improbable love that had reshaped them both. Felix, once a storm of raw power, had softened under Paige's influence, his gang's darker dealings curbed to honor the woman who'd saved his life and heart. Paige, a beacon of discipline, had found in Felix a love that saw her fire, not just her skill. Their journey, 6 months of arguments, laughter, and quiet nights, had led to this moment, where their worlds collided under the scrutiny of Atlanta's elite. The room buzzed with curiosity, nurses and doctors stealing glances at the couple. "That's Fury Donovan," a young intern whispered to a colleague, her voice tinged with awe. "Never thought I'd see him here." Paige felt the weight of their stares but stood taller, her hand resting lightly on Felix's arm. He leaned down, his breath warm against her ear. "You sure about this, Doc? I'm not exactly gala material." His tone was teasing, but his eyes held a flicker of doubt, a rare glimpse of the man who'd once ruled shadows but now navigated her world. Paige's smile was steady, her voice low. "You're mine. That's material enough." Felix's grin, boyish yet fierce, was her reward, and he squeezed her hand, grounding them both in the swirl of opulence. The night unfolded with a rhythm of its own. Paige mingled with colleagues, her poise effortless as she discussed hospital funding with a silver-haired donor, her laughter bright but measured. Felix, though out of his element, held his own, his charm disarming even the stiffest suits. He spoke of local businesses with a passion that surprised the crowd, his protection rackets reframed as community support. A truth Paige had helped him shape, yet the tension of his past lingered. When a board member asked about his associates, Felix's jaw tightened, but Paige's gentle touch on his back steadied him. "They're family," he said simply, his voice firm, and the conversation shifted, the room sensing a line not to cross. Across the ballroom, a group of reapers stood awkwardly near the bar, their usual leather swapped for ill-fitting suits, their presence a nod to Paige's influence. Rico, the wiry one who dubbed her Sis, raised a glass in her direction, his grin infectious. Tommy, his jaw long-heeled from Paige's elbow, nodded stiffly, his respect hard-won but undeniable. Their loyalty to Felix, and now to Paige, was a bridge between her sterile world and their gritty one, a testament to the woman who'd tamed a kingpin's heart. A nurse, Carla, sidled up to Paige, her eyes twinkling. "You've got a knack for miracles, Dr. Mitchell. Saving lives and reforming outlaws?" Paige laughed, the sound rich and unguarded, but her gaze found Felix, and her heart swelled with a quiet truth. They'd saved each other. The music shifted, a slow jazz melody filling the air, and Felix pulled Paige onto the dance floor, his hand firm at her waist. The crowd parted, their whispers a soft hum as the couple moved together, their steps a conversation of trust and defiance. Felix's hand was warm against hers, his scars a map of the life he was rewriting. "You make this look easy," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Paige's eyes held his, her smile a spark. "Nothing about us is easy, but it's worth it." Their dance was a vow, a moment where the world's judgment faded, leaving only them. As the night waned, they slipped onto the hotel's balcony, the city sprawling below like a tapestry of dreams. The cool air carried the scent of magnolia, and Paige leaned against the railing, Felix's arm around her. She thought of their journey, the night she'd faced his crew, the kiss that changed everything, the fights they'd weathered. Their love was a hard-won thing, built on choices and sacrifices. Felix's voice broke the silence, soft but fierce. "You're my home, Doc. Didn't know I needed one till you." Paige turned to him, her hand cupping his cheek, tracing the scar above his brow. "And you're mine," she said, her voice steady, sealing a truth that anchored them. The gala's lights glowed behind them, but out here, Atlanta was theirs, a city that had forged them in its crucible and now bore witness to their rise. Felix's Reapers would always be part of him, a family he'd never abandon, but his heart belonged to Paige, a woman who challenged him to be more. Paige, too, had grown, her disciplined world softened by his raw honesty, her strength amplified by his love. They weren't perfect, his temper still flared, her resolve still clashed, but they were unbreakable, a pair who'd faced down fear and built something real. As they returned to the ballroom, Felix's wink was a promise, his grin a spark that lit her world. The Reapers cheered softly, their sis now their own, and the hospital staff watched with a mix of awe and envy. Atlanta whispered their legend, the doctor and the outlaw, a love that defied the odds. The night ended with a toast, Paige raising her glass to new beginnings, Felix's hand steady at her back. Their future was uncertain, a canvas of possibilities, but together, they were a force, their story a beacon for those who dared to love against the grain. Thank you for joining us on Paige and Felix's unforgettable journey, a tale of courage, love, and redemption that burned bright against Atlanta's shadows. What did you think of their story? Did Paige's fearless stand or Felix's transformation spark something in you? Share your thoughts in the comments. We can't wait to hear how this tale touched you. Drop your city too, and let us know where you're tuning in from. A huge thank you for being part of our storytelling community. Your support fuels every chapter we weave. Don't miss our next saga. Hit that subscribe button to catch the latest stories of heart and defiance. Like, comment, and share to keep the fire alive. Until next time, stay bold, and we'll see you soon for another story that stirs the soul.